Imagine stepping into a land that defies everything you've been told, a land of paradox and contradiction. As Soviet soldiers marched into Germany in 1945, their reactions were a mix of shock, vengeance, and unexpected empathy, unfolding a chapter of history rich with emotional complexity and stark revelations. The prelude to invasion. In the winter of 1945, the landscape of World War II was dramatically shifting. The Soviet Union, having endured the brutal onslaught of Operation Barbarossa and the subsequent horrors of war on their soil, was now poised on the brink of an offensive that would carry its soldiers into the heart of Germany. This chapter was not just a military maneuver. It was the culmination of years of suffering, resilience, and a relentless drive towards what the Red Army perceived as justice. The Vistula Offensive, launched on January 12, 1945, was a masterstroke in Soviet military strategy. By the end of 1944, the German Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self, battered on all fronts and struggling to contend with the Allied forces in the West and the relentless pressure from the Soviet Union in the East. The Red Army, on the other hand, had grown in strength, experience, and confidence, having liberated vast swathes of its territory and pushed the invaders back. The offensive's timing was impeccable. The winter conditions, while harsh, played to the Soviets' advantage, having adapted to such warfare out of necessity. Moreover, the German forces were spread thin, with significant resources diverted to counter the Allied threat in the West, leaving the Eastern Front vulnerable. The Red Army mobilized over 2 million men for the Vistula Offensive, a force comprising multiple fronts aimed at encircling and crushing the German Army Group A, stationed in Poland. The Soviets had learned from past engagements, and their tactics had evolved. The use of combined arms operations, featuring a mix of infantry, armor, and air support, showcased a level of sophistication and coordination that the German forces could no longer match. The offensive was not just a military operation, but also an ideological crusade. For many Soviet soldiers, this was a personal vendetta against an enemy that had brought untold suffering to their homeland. The propaganda machine on both sides had dehumanized the opponent to such an extent that the stage was set for a confrontation marked by extreme brutality and a thirst for retribution. Germany's situation by early 1945 was dire. Hitler's refusal to allow tactical withdrawals had led to the encirclement and destruction of several key units, and the once feared Wehrmacht was now reliant on undertrained, poorly equipped conscripts and Volkssturm, People's Storm, units. The strategic blunders and the Allies' material superiority had turned the tide against Germany, leaving its forces ill-prepared to face the Soviet juggernaut. On the eve of the offensive, the mood among Soviet troops was a mix of anticipation and resolve. They were well aware of the stakes and the suffering endured by their people. Many saw the invasion of Germany as the final act in a long and painful drama, an opportunity to bring the war to the doorstep of those they held responsible for its horrors. The Soviet command, under the leadership of Marshal Georgy Zhukov and others, meticulously planned the assault. The logistical challenges were immense, but the Red Army had become adept at overcoming such hurdles, thanks in part to Lend-Lease supplies from the Allies, which bolstered their mobility and firepower. First impressions and shock length. As Soviet soldiers advanced into German territory, their initial encounters were not just with a defeated enemy, but with a world that seemed to stand in stark contradiction to the images painted by years of war propaganda. The landscapes they marched through and the scenes they witnessed would leave an indelible mark on their consciousness, challenging their preconceived notions and igniting a complex mix of emotions. Upon entering Germany, the Soviet soldiers were met with sights that were incongruous with the destruction and deprivation they had left behind. The German countryside, despite the ongoing war, exhibited a semblance of order and prosperity. The towns and villages, though marked by the war's toll, retained a structural integrity and cleanliness that were foreign to the war-ravaged Soviet soldiers. The well-maintained roads, the orderly fields, and the relatively intact buildings presented a stark contrast to the destruction that had become synonymous with the Eastern Front. For many Soviet soldiers, their first real interaction with German civilians was a moment of profound shock and complexity. Contrary to the expectations of encountering a barbaric and dehumanized enemy, they were met with faces of fear, desperation, and sometimes surprising gestures of civility. German civilians, particularly women and children, often approached the Soviet troops with trepidation, offering whatever little they could: food, water, and sometimes just a weary smile. This unexpected humanization of the enemy stirred a mix of emotions within the soldiers, from empathy to confusion, and at times, a reluctant respect. Perhaps the most jarring discovery for the Soviet troops was the material conditions of German life. Houses, even in small towns, were well built and often furnished with items that were luxuries in the Soviet Union: radios, pianos, and other household goods that spoke of a relatively high standard of living. The presence of such amenities in seemingly ordinary homes challenged the narrative of German destitution and Soviet superiority in providing for its citizens. This revelation was not just a matter of material envy, but a profound ideological shock. Many soldiers, raised on promises of socialist prosperity, found themselves questioning the disparities between what they had been told and the reality before them. The sight of well-stocked shops, intact infrastructure, and the comparative luxury of German domestic life was a direct affront to the sacrifices and hardships endured by the Soviet people. The initial shock of encountering a world so different from their expectations was a source of emotional turmoil for the Soviet soldiers. Feelings of anger and betrayal mingled with a grudging admiration for the efficiency and order of German society. The realization that the enemy they had been conditioned to hate lived in conditions far superior to their own was a bitter pill to swallow. This emotional dissonance was exacerbated by the interactions with German civilians and prisoners of war. The humanity of the enemy, their fear, and their suffering challenged the black-and-white narrative of good versus evil that had been instilled in the soldiers. This conflict between ideological indoctrination and the reality on the ground sowed seeds of doubt and introspection among the ranks. Despite the shock and the questioning, the overarching sentiment among the Soviet troops remained one of vengeance. The memories of German atrocities on Soviet soil, the destruction of their homes, and the loss of millions of lives fueled a deep-seated desire for retribution. This desire was often expressed in acts of violence and destruction against German property, and tragically, against civilians. Yet in this quest for vengeance, there was also a sense of victimhood, a feeling of having been deceived not just by the enemy, but by their own leaders. The disparity between the promised socialist utopia and the reality of German prosperity was a source of disillusionment, contributing to a complex web of emotions that defined the Soviet soldiers' experience in Germany. Destruction and despair length. The Soviet march into Germany, while a military triumph, soon unfolded into a saga of destruction and despair, not just for the German populace, but as a reflection of the deep scars war had etched into the Soviet soldiers themselves. The motivations behind the widespread looting and destruction were complex, rooted in a mix of retribution, disillusionment, and the raw urge for survival, leaving a lasting impact on both the invaders and the civilian population caught in the war's final throes. For many Red Army soldiers, the invasion of Germany was perceived as a long-awaited opportunity for revenge. The memories of German atrocities committed on Soviet soil, villages razed, families slaughtered, and the unimaginable suffering endured during the siege of Leningrad and elsewhere, fueled a deep-seated desire for retribution. This desire manifested in a sometimes indiscriminate destruction of German towns and properties, viewed by many soldiers as a justified repayment for the devastation the Nazis had wrought upon their homeland. The shock of encountering a relatively prosperous German society, as previously discussed, also played a significant role in the ensuing looting and destruction. For soldiers who had been promised a vision of socialist prosperity but found themselves living in conditions far inferior to those of their enemy, the discovery was jarring.
The rate of German surrenders is nearly 1 million a month, as Allied armor rushes relentlessly toward the hostile.
This disillusionment often translated into a destructive impulse, a way to physically manifest their anger and betrayal. Looting, in this context, became a means of compensating for the material deficiencies in their own lives, as well as a symbolic leveling of the perceived injustices. Beyond the motivations of vengeance and disillusionment, the basic human urge for survival also drove Soviet troops to loot German towns and homes. After years of enduring extreme deprivation and hardship, the abundance encountered in Germany presented a means to alleviate immediate needs. Food, clothing, and other supplies were often taken out of necessity, with the harsh winter conditions exacerbating the soldiers' desperation. The consequences of the Soviet troops' actions on German civilians were devastating. Towns and cities were left in ruins, homes were destroyed, and countless cultural artifacts were lost to the flames of retribution. The civilian population, already reeling from the cumulative effects of war, faced a new wave of horror as the Soviet advance turned their world upside down. Many Germans embarked on a desperate flight towards Berlin and other perceived safe havens, a mass exodus marked by chaos and suffering. The roads were filled with refugees braving the sub-zero temperatures, many of whom did not survive the journey. Those who remained or were unable to flee often faced dire consequences. Reports of rape, summary executions, and other atrocities began to emerge, painting a grim picture of the lawlessness and violence that accompanied the Red Army's advance. The widespread destruction and looting by Soviet troops also contributed to a cycle of violence and retribution that would mar relations between the Soviet Union and Germany for generations to come. German survivors and witnesses carried with them memories of the horrors they endured, sowing seeds of resentment and hatred that would linger long after the war's end. The events that unfolded as Soviet soldiers advanced into Germany raised profound questions about the morality of war and the dehumanizing effects of prolonged conflict. While the desire for revenge is a natural human response to suffering and loss, the actions of some Soviet troops underscore the tragic consequences of allowing such impulses to dictate behavior. War's brutality, it seems, spares neither victor nor vanquished from its devastating impacts. The ideological dissonance length. As Soviet soldiers trudged through the remnants of the Third Reich, an unexpected adversary emerged from the rubble of war-torn Germany, the stark revelation of ideological dissonance. Confronted with the tangible markers of German material wealth, the Red Army troops found themselves embroiled in a psychological and ideological turmoil, which deeply challenged their preconceived notions about the enemy, their own country, and the very ideologies that had fueled their long and arduous fight. For years, Soviet soldiers had been galvanized by a narrative that depicted their homeland as a bastion of equality and prosperity, superior to the capitalist and fascist nations of the West. However, as they advanced through German cities and towns, the sight of well-constructed homes, modern amenities, and the relative affluence of even ordinary German civilians starkly contrasted with the scarcity and hardship that characterized life back in the Soviet Union. This confrontation with a different material reality did not just provoke envy or desire, it sparked a profound ideological dissonance. The disparity between the soldiers' expectations and the reality they encountered forced them to question the veracity of the narratives they had been fed. How could a nation deemed morally and ideologically inferior by Soviet propaganda afford its citizens a higher standard of living? The dissonance between the expected degradation and the encountered prosperity of Germany unsettled the soldiers, prompting a reevaluation of their own beliefs and values. The ideological shock experienced by the Soviet soldiers was further compounded by the years of propaganda that had painted a simplistic picture of the enemy. German society was expected to be visibly crumbling under the weight of its fascist ideology, its people desperate and destitute. Instead, the soldiers found a society that, despite the ravages of war, seemed to have maintained a level of civility and material comfort that was alien to the war-weary Soviets. This stark contradiction between propaganda and reality undermined the binary moral framework that had justified the sacrifices and hardships endured by the Soviet people. The realization that the ideological enemy was not the monolithic evil entity they had been led to believe introduced a cognitive dissonance that was difficult to reconcile with the overarching narrative of the Great Patriotic War. The ideological dissonance experienced by the Soviet soldiers was not merely a matter of reconciling material disparities, it was a profound questioning of the very foundations of their beliefs. For some, this led to a deeper, more introspective search for understanding. They began to question not only the external enemy, but also the internal mechanisms of control and misinformation that had shaped their worldview. This period of reflection was often a solitary journey, as expressing doubts or criticisms of the Soviet system was dangerous. Yet the silent questioning of some soldiers represented a crack in the ideological monolith of the Soviet war effort, suggesting a complex internal struggle that mirrored the external conflict. The Soviet military and political leadership were acutely aware of the potential destabilizing effect of this ideological dissonance. Efforts to manage the narrative were intensified, with political officers and censorship mechanisms working overtime to contain the spread of harmful observations and to reassert the official ideology. Soldiers were reminded of the sacrifices of the Soviet people and the moral imperative of their mission, in an attempt to realign personal experiences with the collective narrative. However, these efforts could not fully erase the lived experiences of the soldiers or their silent questions. The encounter with German prosperity remained a troubling undercurrent, a dissonant chord in the victory symphony of the Soviet Union. Encounters with German civilians length. In the shadow of the overarching narrative of conquest and retribution that characterized the Soviet advance into Germany in 1945, a mosaic of human interactions unfolded, painting a complex picture of the encounters between Soviet soldiers and German civilians. These interactions, marked by moments of unexpected kindness, empathy, as well as hostility and violence, reveal the nuanced tapestry of human emotions that defy the simplistic binaries of friend and foe, victor and vanquished. As the Red Army advanced, Soviet soldiers encountered German civilians in various contexts, within the remnants of bombed-out cities, in the countryside fleeing the advance, and in their homes, awaiting their fate. Each encounter was a meeting of worlds, charged with the potential for violence, but also for unexpected connections. Despite the backdrop of brutality and vengeance, there were moments where the shared human experience transcended the barriers of nationality and war. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had experienced the loss of their own homes and families, sometimes showed surprising empathy towards German civilians. Instances of soldiers sharing their rations with starving German families, offering medical aid to the wounded, or sparing civilians from violence were not unheard of. These acts of kindness, though not universal, highlighted the capacity for compassion even in the midst of conflict. In some cases, these interactions led to brief, unlikely friendships or moments of understanding. Soldiers and civilians, finding common ground in their mutual exhaustion and yearning for peace, would share stories of their loved ones, their hopes, and their fears. These interactions, fleeting as they were, served as a poignant reminder of the common humanity that persists even in the darkest times. However, the encounters between Soviet soldiers and German civilians were often marred by hostility and violence, a reflection of the deep-seated anger and desire for revenge that many soldiers harbored. The memories of Nazi atrocities committed in the Soviet Union fueled acts of retribution against German civilians, who were often seen as complicit in their nation's crimes. Reports of looting, rape, and violence perpetrated by some Soviet soldiers against German civilians are well documented and represent a tragic aspect of the liberation. These actions, while driven by a complex mix of vengeance, dehumanization, and the chaos of war, left deep scars on the civilian population and added a dark chapter to the history of the conflict. The varied interactions between Soviet soldiers and German civilians underscore the moral complexity and the profound psychological toll of war. Soldiers, propelled into the role of occupiers, had to navigate their own feelings of hatred, empathy, and indifference in the face of the suffering and vulnerability of the civilian population. For many soldiers, the act of showing kindness or hostility was not just a personal choice, but a reflection of their own experiences of loss and survival. The war had forced them into situations where moral clarity was often obscured by the immediacy of survival, vengeance, or the influence of military culture and propaganda. The encounters between Soviet soldiers and German civilians highlight the profound human cost of war, not just in terms of physical destruction, but also in the erosion of empathy, the perpetuation of cycles of violence, and the long-lasting trauma inflicted on individuals and communities. These interactions, with their mix of kindness and cruelty, empathy and hostility, offer a window into the complex psychological landscape of war, where human emotions and moral choices are tested in the extreme, the fate of the liberated and the captured length. In the vast and brutal theater of World War II, the fate of individuals, whether they were Soviet POWs, forced laborers, or German prisoners, was often lost in the grand narratives of victory and defeat. Yet their stories provide a crucial insight into the human cost of the conflict and the complex aftermath of liberation and capture. The liberation of Soviet POWs and forced laborers by advancing Soviet forces should have been a moment of unbridled joy and relief. Instead, it was often tainted by suspicion and the harsh realities of Stalinist policy. Many of these individuals had survived the harshest conditions, including starvation, forced labor, and the constant threat of death, only to find that their return home was fraught with new challenges. The Stalinist regime, deeply paranoid and unforgiving, viewed returning POWs and forced laborers with suspicion, often branding them as traitors or cowards for allowing themselves to be captured. Instead of being welcomed as heroes, many were subjected to scrutiny, interrogation, and even imprisonment. The NKVD, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, played a significant role in screening returnees, many of whom were sent to Gulag labor camps for re-education under the guise of ensuring their loyalty. This treatment of liberated Soviet citizens highlights the tragic irony of their situation, surviving the horrors of captivity, only to face persecution at the hands of their own government. It reflects the broader climate of fear and repression that characterized the Stalinist regime, where the lines between friend and foe were blurred by paranoia and political expediency. The fate of German prisoners captured by Soviet forces was equally grim, albeit for different reasons. The vast numbers of German soldiers taken prisoner in the final stages of the war overwhelmed the Soviet prison camp system, leading to dire conditions similar to those experienced by Soviet POWs in German custody. Overcrowding, inadequate food, harsh labor, and exposure to the elements were common, leading to high mortality rates among German POWs. The treatment of German prisoners was driven by a combination of retribution for the suffering inflicted by the Wehrmacht on the Soviet Union and the practicalities of post-war reconstruction. German POWs were often used as forced labor to rebuild the war-torn Soviet infrastructure, a practice that, while contributing to the Soviet recovery effort, raised ethical questions about the treatment of prisoners under the Geneva Conventions. The treatment of both Soviet and German individuals in the aftermath of liberation and capture underscores the complex interplay of vengeance, justice, and humanity in the context of war. For the Soviet leadership, the war was not just a military conflict, but an existential struggle that justified harsh measures against both real and perceived enemies. Yet among the rank and file of the Red Army and the civilian population, there were instances of empathy and kindness towards former enemies, reflecting a more nuanced human response to the war's end. The long-term impact of the war on those who were liberated or captured cannot be overstated. For Soviet returnees, the stigma of captivity and the experience of repression had lasting effects on their lives and their families. Many were silenced by fear or shame, their stories buried under the weight of official narratives that celebrated victory at the expense of individual suffering. For German prisoners in the Soviet Union, the experience of captivity and the struggle for survival left deep scars. Those who returned to Germany often found a country in ruins, grappling with its own complex legacy of guilt, defeat, and the task of rebuilding.